Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. A freilich and Hanukkah to everybody. It's wonderful to see you at the Arbesfeld, not Kollel and Midreshet Yom Rishon, but it's in keeping with the same aspects of what we do. Today's a special day, and I'm not going to introduce it. I'm just going to express hakaras hatov to the Mervis family upon the establishment last year of the Mervis annual lecture in memory of their father, a blessed memory, a Wayum Musmuch, who was a courageous and wonderful pulpit rabbi for his entire life. And I hope you enjoy the learning as much as we do. This is incorporated in the Straus Center for Jewish Thought and for Jewish, what is it called? Torah and Western Thought. Thank you very much. And it's really my pleasure to introduce you to our benefactor, Ted Mirvis.
Good morning. I'm Ted Mervis. My brother David and I, and Ruthie and Linny, thank you for joining here for this inaugural Rabbi Allan Mervis lecture in commemoration and celebration of the lifetime work of our father, Rav Avram ben Tzvi V'Sar Freder Mervis Zichrono Livracha. Welcome and a thank you especially to Rabbi Soloveichik and the Straus Center, the natural place for a lecture series in our father's name. As the president mentioned, our father graduated Yeshiva College and received his smicha from Reitz in 1941, signed by the Rav and Dr. Belkin. Reitz sent our father to serve as the pulpit rabbi at Bnei Israel Synagogue in Hampton, Virginia, a city of about 80,000 in southeastern Virginia, where he stayed for 32 years. There were no tryouts, no choices. Things were different in those days. Bnei Israel was a small synagogue. It originally stood on the corner of King and Queen Streets in downtown Hampton. It was affiliated with the OU. By today's standards, it was not the usual Orthodox synagogue. Never more than 90 families as members, maybe one or two kosher homes, maybe one or two Shomer Shabbat. Late service Friday evenings at 8 p.m. year-round, followed by a collation in the Seer Auditorium next door. Mostly non-observant families holding on to a sense of Jewishness under the pressures of the New World. My father had grown up in Baltimore. He loved to tell the story of his being on the 80-pound track team while a senior at City High School. The day of one meet, he weighed in 2 pounds overweight. So the coach gave him a candy bar and told him to run around the track until he met the 80-pound limit. My father met the 80-pound limit. Even so, Hampton must have been a real change. My father was beloved in Hampton. I remembered the detailed questions my father got from congregants about cleaning for Pesach in particular. Do curtains have to be changed? What about slip covers, upholstery, Venetian blinds? Good people who would have been mortified to find a scrap of chametz in their house at the Seder. Kosher food at the Seder? Not so much. But people whose connection to their faith was this young rabbi, newly arrived from the north at age 24, who met and married my mother in Hampton, Virginia, who started a yeshiva katana in his synagogue building when I was in second grade. 4 students in my grade, adding a class every year through the 6th grade. My father taught 1 grade, and for a few years, my mother was the school principal. These congregants loved my father, and my father took his job, his task, his work very seriously. My father, as the local rabbi, used to speak in the big public school where I went to junior high school every year in the commemoration of what was then called, decorously, Brotherhood Week, H. Wilson Thorpe Junior High School. There was always a priest, a minister, and my father. And my father served as chaplain for the military 1 day a week at the local military bases, Fort Monroe, Fort Eustis, Langley Field, where the Mercury astronauts trained. Our father never threw out anything. I'll say it again. My father never threw out anything. All of his sermons, delivered mostly at the Friday night services and of course on the high holidays when the sanctuary was full, not unlike New York, every sermon script or talking note was meticulously filed and kept. Every bar mitzvah boy message and bat mitzvah girl message. Boxes of paper that traveled with our father when first he and our mother semi-retired to Miami Beach and then to Jerusalem, where our father lived the last 20 years of his life. In Jerusalem, my father spent many years as head of the OU conversion program. That brought him into direct contact and sometimes conflict with clerics of the Israeli rabbinate. Rabbis who, regardless of their level of scholarship or learning, seemed to have little relationship or understanding about the needs and problems of real people. My brother's son, my nephew, Rabbi Mirvis, also a Yeshiva college grad, with smicha from the Gush, who now lives in Tzfat. Simi has done a remarkable mitzvah in organizing and digitizing all of my father's sermons over 32 years. A few I think I remembered hearing as a young boy. Most, of course, when I looked at them, were new to me. Reading through some of them led me to consider the power and place of the shul rabbi. Perhaps especially, but I don't think uniquely, in a small town like Hampton, Virginia. The shul rabbi who was often the congregants' one and only connection to Judaism, to their faith, to their history. My father poured his heart and soul into his sermons. So many were filled with gentle urgings, urging his congregants to renew the experience of lighting candles on Shabbat, to have family meals on Shabbat, to guide their children to attend Sunday school, to come to services in the synagogue, to resist the siren song that being American meant abandoning old traditions. Thinking back to my father's work in Hampton obviously asked the question I hope we will learn about today and into the future. To me, the relative role and authority of the shul rabbi, as compared with the Beit Midrash Rosh Yeshiva, is an important and complex topic. How does the rabbi in the field, ministering to people with everyday conflicts and tensions and concerns and complexities, how does that rabbi share decisional power and guidance with the academy, with the yeshiva, the ivory tower perhaps, where erudition and scholarship may take precedence, but people's problems and struggles are never really very far away? Of course, I don't think that issue is unique to Judaism or even to religion. The academy versus the real world is a recurring theme across many planes and disciplines. I don't mean what is captured by the quip that those who can do and those who can't teach. I mean, where should the source be to make decisions about halacha and hashkafa, to set norms of conduct and behavior and language and outlook, to be the model that separates the authentic and the real from the merely zealous and the outwardly conforming? But enough before I get into trouble. Thank you all. Thank you, Rabbi Soloveichik, and I really appreciate everyone being here today. Thank you.
Well, let me begin. Can everyone hear me? Great. Let me begin by thanking Ted for his very moving words of introduction and description of his father's life, and for his faith in and his generosity to the mission and the vision of the Straus Center. I want to thank President Joel, not just for being here, but for his friendship and constant encouragement and advice. And I want to recognize the presence of Moshael Straus, my partner in everything that we do at the Straus Center. And I want to thank the entire Mervis family for giving me the opportunity to both honor the legacy of Rabbi Allan Mervis and to speak about a vocation that is near and dear to my heart, that of a community rabbi. This is a lecture about leadership. And so perhaps we can begin with a story about the 20th century's greatest leader, Winston Churchill. A tale that also relates, if you will, to the holiday season. In 1944, Isaiah Berlin, later a celebrated political philosopher at Oxford, was working for English intelligence in the British Embassy in Washington. And he would send reports back to London from the British Embassy. Churchill in London would read these reports and sense the brilliance of the person writing them. And he yearned to actually get the opportunity to meet this Mr. Berlin who was writing them in person, to talk politics, to talk about the war and much else. Then in May of 1944, London was visited not by Isaiah Berlin, but by Irving Berlin, the American songwriter with the distinction of having composed the best-selling Christmas song of all time. Irving Berlin made a very generous donation to the British war effort, to a charity that was overseen by Clementine Churchill, Churchill's wife. And so Mrs. Churchill said to Winston, she said, "Mr. Berlin is in town, and he's been very generous to us." This is a true story. And she says, "If you meet him, just tell him that we're very pleased with him." And Churchill said, "Mr. Berlin is in town," assuming it was Isaiah Berlin. He said, "Oh, I want him to come to lunch with me." So Clementine said, no, it's not necessary. I just mean, if you meet him, just pat him on the shoulder and say that we're very grateful for whatever he's done. He insists. He says, "I want him to come to lunch." She couldn't understand why, so she invites him. So Irving Berlin comes to lunch, sits next to Winston Churchill, and Churchill says to him, he says, "So Mr. Berlin, what is the most important piece of work that you've done for us lately, in your opinion?" Poor Berlin obviously couldn't make out what this man had just said, so he said, after some hesitation, he says, "I don't know, I guess White Christmas, I suppose." So then Winston's a little confused by this, and he turned to Berlin again, and he said, "Tell me, as someone in the United States now, do you think Roosevelt will be reelected this year?" And Irving Berlin said, "Well, in the past I voted for him, but this year I'm not so sure." And now he's confused why the representative of British intelligence is voting in American elections. As Isaiah Berlin, looking back later, said, Winston was confused because obviously my dispatches were coherent, but he thought that he had an idiot right in front of him. So finally Winston says, "Mr. Berlin, when do you think the European war is going to end?" And Irving Berlin says, "Sir, I shall never forget this moment. When I go back to my own country, I shall tell my children and my children's children that in the spring of 1944, the Prime Minister of Great Britain asked me when the European war was going to end." So at this point, he lost his temper, got up, lunch was over. Poor Irving Berlin went off to the Savoy, where he was sharing rooms with Sir Alexander Korda, himself a movie producer. And he said to Korda, he says, "You know, Churchill is probably the greatest leader in England or in the world, but I don't know what it was. I felt somehow that we did not click. I don't know. Now, Clementine Churchill, I could talk to her always, but with him, something, I just can't make it out." And meanwhile, Winston Churchill got up from the lunch and said to his staff, he said, "Berlin is just like most bureaucrats. Wonderful on paper, but disappointing when you meet them face to face." Now, it's an amusing story, but also relevant. In his introduction, Ted gave voice to the concern that at times, levels of scholarship or learning do not always necessarily define the full essence of Jewish leadership, because a necessary component of leadership is relationships with or understanding of real people. Though I might have expressed it slightly differently, it was Isaiah Berlin who once gave voice to almost the exact same idea, Ted, in an essay that was titled "On Political Judgment." And in this essay, Berlin wrote that what is called wisdom in leaders is, what he wrote is, it's actually understanding rather than knowledge. In Berlin's words, it's some kind of acquaintance with relevant facts of such a kind that enable those who have it to tell what fits with what can be done in given circumstances, and what cannot. In Berlin's words, it is a capacity, in the first place, for synthesis rather than analysis, for knowledge in the sense which conductors know their orchestras, as opposed to the knowledge in which chemists know the contents of their test tubes, or mathematicians know the rules that their symbols obey. In other words, what Berlin is saying is that leadership is often an art rather than a science. And so, with this in mind, how can we appreciate the critical role played by the academy, the yeshiva, and still recognize the unique role for Jewish leadership outside the yeshiva in a shifting world? I propose that the answer lies in the matter that is at the heart of this amusing Churchill-Berlin story, and that is identity. In recognizing the unique identities of individuals and of the different roles that they have to play in the heart of a nation. We find ourselves now in the midst of a Hanukkah celebration, commemorating the Hashmona'i victory and the resulting rededication of the temple that took place in 165 BCE. And yet we know that at the moment that occurred, in 165, the military victory was in no way complete. The temple was cleansed, but the Seleucid Empire was still at war with the Hashmonaim. In fact, the fortress right next to the Beit HaMikdash, the Accra fortress, was occupied by the Jewish Hellenists, who were firing on whoever attempted to approach the Mikdash. It was only a good decade later, with Yehudah Maccabee already gone, in the age of his brother Shimon, that the war was won and Jewish independence earned, and a Hasmonean Kohanic dynasty of kings declared. So one version of this in the book of Maccabees describes how the Jews proclaimed, quote, Shimon and his descendants as their leaders, that means their kings, ultimately, their leaders and high priests. Shimon shall govern their country, they agreed, have charge of the temple, and shall be their military commander. The people must obey him in everything. All government contracts shall be drawn up in his name. He shall have the right to wear royal robes, end quote. At this moment, a member of the Hashmona'i family became simultaneously Kohen Gadol and king. Two identities, two archetypes of leadership merging into one. And from a certain perspective, this should be one of the most important moments in Jewish history. The first time that the Jews achieved sovereignty in the Second Temple period, it should be celebrated as a Yom HaAtzmaut in its own right. And yet it is not. And we know that in studying Jewish history, that it was all downhill from there for the Hasmonean dynasty. Shimon was murdered by his son-in-law, and the Hasmonean dynasty fell eventually to fratricide, insanity, and ultimately the power of Rome. For Ramban, if the once great Hasmonean family met a swift and ignominious end, if we celebrate on this Yom Tov the Chanukhat Habayit of the Maccabees, but not the monarchy that came later, if we celebrate the Beit HaMikdash and the Kohanim in the Beit HaMikdash, but not the kingship of the Kohanim, it was because the establishment of that kingship was this original sin of this dynasty, of Kohanim becoming kings. This, Ramban explains, was first of all because the kingship is designated not for the tribe of Levi, but for Yehudah, as we will read in 2 weeks, Lo Yasur Shevet Mi Yehudah Umechokek Mi Bein Raglav. But also, and perhaps even more importantly, Ramban adds, building on a Yerushalmi, because there is a particular prohibition for Kohanim to become kings. Crowning a Kohen Gadol involves the merging of two identities, two vital institutions, says Ramban, that cannot be joined. And it's this question that I hope to address. Why can a Kohen not be a king? What's the problem with uniting Keter Kuna and Keter Malchut? What's wrong if the Kohen Gadol is also the Melech? Some might say in explanation that what we find here is a separation of church and state, or Mikdash and state. After all, one might say the Kohanim are the religious leaders and the kings are secular ones. But this is clearly inaccurate. It's true, of course, that the Kohanim in the Mikdash are the halachic authorities par excellence. Yoru mishpatecha liYaakov v'toratecha liYisrael, says Moshe. The Kohanim are the ones who are meant to teach Torah, paskin the most important shilos. But Malchut, kingship, clearly has a spiritual component as well. The anointing of kings in Tanakh, Shaul and David, is immediately followed by psukim such as Vatitzlach alav ruach Hashem, that the Spirit of God rested on them. The king, unlike any other figure in Israel, is obligated not only to write a Sefer Torah, but to carry it with him amongst the people of Israel wherever he goes. Moreover, as Rav Moshe Lichtenstein has noted in a series of lectures on Jewish political thought, Chazal understood a particular passage in the Torah as a mitzvah incumbent on the monarch, which reflects his specific Torah educational role. And this is Hakel, which mandates a public assembly of the entire nation where the king teaches Torah. Here, Rabbi Lichtenstein notes the monarch's role as that of national Torah teacher, teaching men, women, and children throughout the kingdom. So not only a Kohen, but also a Jewish king too is meant to be a spiritual leader. So why should we not combine Kohen and king? Why shouldn't we get two for the price of one? What's so bad if we unite the two? I wish to propose today that king and Kohen embody two different models of Jewish leadership that are diametrically different but complementary, both deeply spiritual in their own way, both essential, both relevant to pondering the future of Jewish leadership of the next generation. I'll begin by pondering the Jewish conception of kingship, contrasting it with the secular notion of monarchs, so that drawing on Torah and halacha, we will know what Jews mean by the word king and how we differ from the general conception of royalty in society. Now, those who know me understand that I consider questions such as these vital, both professionally and personally. Professionally, because in the Straus Center we have striven to show that ancient concepts of Jewish politics are as relevant today as ever, and that these sources can serve as a foundation for modern Jewish political and social thought. And personally, because my friends know that I am a huge Anglophile, and that king and nobility are some of my favorite subjects. A couple weeks ago in Shul, I actually gave a Jewish introduction to the new season of Downton Abbey, which will be premiering soon. And I actually have studied Britain's conceptions of coronation and kings throughout the ages in order to contrast it with the Jewish one. I have read books just to prepare for this lecture about the houses of Tudor, Stuart, Hanover, Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, and Windsor. I have read Churchill's multi-volume history of the English-speaking peoples, and I have seen the most important plays and films about kings. Beckett, A Man for All Seasons, Henry V, The King's Speech, The King and I, and The Lion King. And understanding the distinct roles of king and Kohen, I will hope to reveal, will be not only an essential exercise for Jewish theology and Jewish political thought, but for understanding the essence of Jewish leadership in general, and the future of the rabbinate in particular, for American Jewry today. We begin by contrasting the common conception of kingship with the Jewish one. For over 1,000 years, the crowning of an English king or queen has featured a reference to the anointing of King Solomon Shlomo HaMelech. In 1953, the Archbishop of Canterbury said, as he anointed Elizabeth II, quote, "As Solomon was anointed by Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet, so be thou anointed, blessed and consecrated queen over the peoples, whom the Lord thy God hath given thee to govern." Handel, for George II, composed a coronation hymn, whose words cite scripture and is sung at every British coronation to this day. The words are, "Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anointed Solomon king, and all the people rejoiced and said, long live the king." And we can understand why Handel chose this verse, this scene. The anointing of Shlomo HaMelech in Tanakh featured magnificent crowds, Kohanim and Nevi'im, priests and prophets proclaiming, crowds cheering, Yechi HaMelech Shlomo Liolam, long live the king. The underlying assumption, though, is that it is the pomp and circumstance that creates a coronation, that makes a monarch. As one civilian soldier remarks in Shakespeare's Henry V, "What have kings that privates have not too, save ceremony, save general ceremony?" And yet the Tanakh has always seen the anointing of Shlomo's father, David, as much more significant. The Navi Shmuel had been sent to Beit Lechem to crown a new king. And he sought someone like Shaul, tall, masculine, with the makings of a mighty warrior. And he comes to a place in Beit Lechem which has no crowds, no Kohanim, no pomp and circumstance. And he's looking for somebody who looks like Shaul, and God says, Al tabeit el mareu ki ma'astiv. Do not seek the superficial. I reject that. Ha'adam yireh la'inayim v'Hashem yireh la'levav. Man looks to what he sees, but God looks to the heart. Royalty, it would seem, for Judaism is a matter of the heart. And in the expansion of the heart of the king, to include the needs, physical and spiritual, of the people. And perhaps one of the most important statements on Jewish monarchy and halakha, Rambam writes that if the Torah cares so much about the spiritual formation of the monarch, if it requires that he carry a Torah constantly and study it all the time, it's because, says the Rambam, because al hasaras libo hikpida Torah, the Torah was so concerned about the religious devotion in the heart of the king because shelibo hulev kol kahal Yisrael. His heart is the heart of the entire Jewish people. It is expanding one's heart beyond oneself, living for others. That is the essence of royalty. In the wonderful film, The King's Speech, we see the story of the King of England's relationship with his speech therapist, Lionel Logue. In order that they be equals during therapy, Logue insists that he call the king Bertie. But of course they are not equals, and the king treats him the entire time as a servant, never calling him Lionel, always calling him Logue. At the end of the film, when the king, thanks to Logue's help, successfully gives his wartime speech, he first says, "Thank you, Logue," but then the king walks over, shakes Logue's hands and says, "Thank you, my friend." And only then does Logue, instead of saying, "Bertie," he says, "Thank you, your majesty." The point is that Logue understood that it was precisely the king expanding his circle of friends beyond himself, beyond what he needed to. That is what made him majestic. And that, I think, is the meaning behind the commonly quoted concept, whose origin lies in the Pirkei de Rabbi Lezer, that chatan doma lamelech, that a groom is akin to a king. It's a little odd when you think about it, because we associate kings with power. And I've been a chatan, and I've been a chatan in a wedding, and nobody listened to me about anything. I wasn't in charge. And I read recently the book We Too, which is a description of the marriage of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. And the book describes how when Queen Victoria got into an argument with her husband, Prince Albert, he locked himself in the bedroom. And she knocked on the door, and he said, "Who's there?" And she said, "The Queen of England." No answer. Again a knock. "Who's there?" "It's your wife, Albert." And then the door opens. The truth is that we Jews may not marry kings and queens, but it is the fact that we choose to marry, as we understand it, that makes us kings and queens. Because royalty lies not in power, but in expanding life beyond oneself. And pledging at a wedding to live our lives for someone other than ourselves is what makes us royal. And if expanding our lives to embrace others is royal, then that is because this is precisely the nature of the Almighty's royalty. Adon olam asher malach b'terem kol yitzir nivra. Master of the universe who reigned before creation. Li'et nasa b'cheftzo kol. When all at God's will came into being, when creation happened, azai melech shemo nikra. Then and only then could God be called king. God only becomes a king because he makes room in his world, room in his divine life for others. In contrast to the customary coronation of kings, in which a people first exist and then they crown a monarch, God becomes king by allowing his people, humanity, to come into existence. What made the Almighty a monarch is that though utterly self-sufficient, he was not satisfied to live in existence all alone, and that he therefore, purely out of love, brought the universe into being. In Jewish mysticism, this is described as a great mystery. God, though infinite and everywhere and all-consuming, lovingly made room somehow for the universe to come into being, and thereby God becomes a king. So a king is defined in Judaism not by the ceremonial palace and guard that set him apart from the people, but the very opposite. In an address delivered by the Rav Zatzal that was only recently published, which was titled Sanctity and Sovereignty, the Rav notes that in Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism, we equate the Shekhinah, the aspect of God that embodies the divine presence of God that dwells amidst the people here on earth. The Shekhinah is equated with the Sfira of Malchut, royalty. We would have thought that the transcendent aspect of God would be equated with royalty, but the opposite is the case. Because for Judaism, writes the Rav, an open existence is a royal existence. The king resides in the midst of the people. He is always close to his subjects and accessible to them. Everybody and everyone may approach the king. Widow, orphan, woodchopper, water drawer, vagabond, stranger, old-timer, sinner, or thief. Each may complain to him, demand justice, and ask for help. You know, I watched around a year and a half ago Steven Spielberg's wonderful film Lincoln, about his fight for the passage of the 13th and 14th Amendments. But one of the most striking things to me is that you saw in the film how different the White House was then, and that anybody could walk in at any time and complain or kvetch or plead with the president about his personal problem. People would just knock on his door and say, here's my tsaras. I need to tell you, the President of the United States, about my tsaras. How different it is today, where a huge gate and a Secret Service keep people out, or at least unsuccessfully attempt to keep people out. You know, I had the opportunity a couple times to attend the White House Hanukkah party, and it was a privilege. But when you go, it's not the same. You wait in line outside, you show your ID, they look you up, and then when you're allowed in, you basically go to the East Wing, nowhere really important. You wait in another line for 35 minutes. You meet the president for 20 seconds. Someone tells him your name. He pretends like he knows who you are, and you're done. And again, I don't want to complain. It was a great experience. It was a schus. I met President Bush. He was told I was a rabbi. He said, "Rabbi, thanks for all your good work for the Lord." Which is very kind of him. He doesn't know me. For all he knows, I do terrible work for the Lord. He has no idea. But you stand, after that, you meet the president, and then you stand around in 2 rooms, you schmooze, and sooner or later you have to get out of there. A friend of mine, Tevi Troy, who worked for President Bush, once reflected in an article that in the Hanukkah parties, he wrote, that Jewish visitors to the White House often live up to the old maxim that Gentiles leave without saying goodbye, while Jews say goodbye and never leave. He wrote, after one particularly late night at the White House, Chief of Staff Josh Bolton, who is Jewish, joked that the White House military aides, who staff official events in full ceremonial garb, had to unsheath their swords in order to get Hanukkah celebrants to exit the residence. Okay, so that's the White House as the palace of a king, which, if you're lucky, the privileged few can come in. Contrast the modern White House with Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson fashioned himself a man of the people. He would open up the White House to the public, to anyone who wanted to come. In 1825, a farmer from Oswego County, New York, honored Jackson with a 1,400-pound cheddar cheese. Jackson wasn't sure what to do with it, so the cheese sat, aging, in the White House lobby for 2 years. And then on Washington's birthday, which used to be a real Yom Tov, now it's just, we don't even have Washington's birthday. We just celebrate in between Washington's and Lincoln's birthday. We celebrate, apparently, sales on and auto sales or something like that. It's no longer Lincoln's birthday, now it's Lincoln Mercury birthday. Okay? So on Washington's birthday, Andrew Jackson had a public reception, and he invited everyone in Washington, D.C. to come and eat the cheese. They polished it off in 2 hours, and they weren't even Jewish, so it's amazing. Cheddar grains were ground into the East Room, and the White House smelled of cheese for weeks. We see this as quaint, uniquely early American democratic phenomenon. Surely not something that could ever happen in a royal palace. But that's because we don't understand Jewish royalty, and it's because we usually replace the Haftorah of Miketz, which was yesterday, with the Haftorah of Shabbat Hanukkah. Because if we read the Haftorah of Miketz, everyone would pay attention. No one would not pay attention to the Haftorah. Surely no one would go out, maybe have a l'chaim during the Haftorah. That's unthinkable. And if you focused on the Haftorah of Parshas Miketz, you would read the famous story of Shlomo HaMelech sitting in his palace as everyone comes in and presents their problems to the king, and he adjudicates them. And the Haftorah has the famous story of the 2 mothers arguing over the baby. Who were these mothers? Quote, I quote in English, "Then came these two women that were women of ill repute unto the king and stood before him." That's who's coming into the royal palace. To have the king, Shlomo HaMelech, at a time, the only time in Jewish history, when the Jewish monarchy ruled a superpower. And Jews of the lowliest level would take a spazier into Yerushalayim and come into the palace to talk to the king and present their problems. As Rav Soloveichik points out, kingship, in general historical terms, precipitates the separation of the king from his people, his existential exclusiveness. However, in Judaism, malchut means integration of the individual in the community, and existential all-inclusiveness and openness. The king opens himself up to everyone and embraces the entire nation without excluding anybody. Melech libo lev kol ha'am, the Rambam writes again. The king's heart is the heart of all the people. Malchut requires of man, he writes, not only to be aware of the existence of others, but also to feel, to experience their existence as if it were his own. Here, a contrast between Melech and Kohen, and particularly Melech, king, and Kohen Gadol begins to emerge. The Kohen Gadol's job is to remain in the Beit HaMikdash, a palace, a true palace, in whose inner sanctuaries, the Heichal, few are welcome, few are halachically allowed to enter. The Kohen Gadol represents the Jewish people before God, but because of his duties, cannot spend time with the Jewish people. Regarding the high priest, the Rambam informs us, Ubayet yiyeh muchan b'mikdash. He had his own little apartment in the Beit HaMikdash, a timeshare in the Beit HaMikdash, but a timeshare that was a permanent timeshare. Ukvodo v'tifarto, writes the Rambam, sheyeh yoshev tamid b'mikdash, and his honor demands that he always dwells in the Mikdash. V'lo yetzei ela labeito bilvad, and he only leaves at night to go home, and adds the Rambam, V'yeh beito b'Yerushalayim, and his home has to be in Yerushalayim. Ve'eno zaz misham, and he can never leave Jerusalem. That's where he stays. He's staying in the Beit HaMikdash in a pure state with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's essential to his identity, it's essential to his sanctity, it's essential to his position, it's essential to his job. Similarly, the Sanhedrin HaGadol, the great Sanhedrin, which answered the most complex questions of Jewish law, sat not amidst the people, but rather in the Lishkat HaGazit, the chamber of hewn stone, in the Beit HaMikdash. To achieve the level of knowledge necessary and the level of divine inspiration necessary for this function, which meant that they had to answer the most complex questions, that required a connection to the divine within the sacred site of Har HaBayit itself. Indeed, according to tradition, according to the Torah, the Sanhedrin was ideally supposed to be made up of Kohanim exclusively. Now, what about the king? Contrast that to a king. The king, however, is very different. The king, as we just saw, is amongst the people. The king writes a Torah of his own, and he brings that Torah to the people. He, not the Kohen Gadol, represents the Torah to the people. The king has a spiritual role. Now the Rambam writes, interestingly, that when the king first writes this Torah scroll, he first brings it to the Beit HaMikdash, where it is checked in the presence of the Sanhedrin against the Sefer HaAzara, the oldest Torah that we have in the world, which tradition held was the Torah written by Moshael Rabbeinu himself. Interestingly, by the way, Josephus writes that when they paraded the vessels of the temple in Rome, the last thing in the parade was a sefer from the Beit HaMikdash. Last of all was the scroll of the Jews. Most Jews think that the greatest treasure that was taken from the Beit HaMikdash was the menorah. That's why half the Jews I know, they go to the Vatican and they ask the Vatican for the menorah back, apparently reflecting the belief that A, the Vatican is hiding the menorah, and B, if they ask really nicely, the Vatican will give it back. But the fact is, this was the greatest treasure, the oldest Torah that they had. The king writes his own Torah scroll, brings it to the Beit HaMikdash in the presence of the Sanhedrin. They check the Torah scroll to make sure it's accurate, and then he goes out and takes his Torah out to the people. The symbolism is profound. The king's principles, his own religious worldview, is formed by and guided by the Torah and the tradition of those who dwell in the Mikdash, those who dwell amidst the holy. But then after that, it is the king's duty, his unique task, to stay not only in the holy, but to bring that Torah out to the world, to bring that holiness to the world, to bring that Torah to the world. And so we see then, actually, that in a speech in which we are called to ponder the rabbanos, rabbis like Rabbi Mirvis. Rabbis, one might think, are more compared to priests, to kohanim, but that's not necessarily the case. Not all rabbis are like priests. I actually had the opportunity to visit and speak in the Vatican a couple weeks ago, and had the singular experience of having a catered kosher lunch in the Vatican with a mashgiach. I don't think he's the full-time mashgiach in the Vatican, but it was a singular experience. The entire experience was singular. Took me like around half an hour to find a place where I could daven mincha, because everywhere I look I'm facing a huge crucifix. But as I come into the Vatican, I pass this a special place guarded by Swiss guards, and they don't see my yarmulke. I'm wearing a coat, and I was wearing my Sephardic Hamburg, and the Swiss guard salutes, and he says, "Good morning, Father." And I didn't tell him I wasn't a priest. The truth is, though, rabbis are like Jewish priests in certain respects, but we see now that rabbis can be very much like the Jewish concept of malchut. Not because rabbis have power like a king. I can tell you they surely do not. But rather because the true Jewish essence of royalty is both making your life about others and taking the Torah, the Jewish tradition, and bringing that Torah to the world. And so a consideration of Kohen and king reveals the virtues and the vulnerabilities of each job. One remarkable essay on leadership was penned by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, reflecting on Parshat Vayikra. There the Torah prescribes different forms of korban chatas, sin offerings, depending on who made the mistake. As he writes, it enumerates 4 categories. There's the Kohen Gadol, then there's what's called the Par Helam Davar Shel Tzibor, that's when the Sanhedrin makes a mistake. Then there's the third, and that's the Nasi. The Nasi is the Melech. And then there's an ordinary individual. In 3 of the 4 cases of sin, the law is introduced by the word im, if the high priest makes a mistake. But in the case of a Nasi, a king, a leader, there the pasuk is prefaced by the words Asher Nasi Yechata, when the leader sins. As he notes, it's possible that the high priest, the supreme court, or individual will make a mistake. But in the case of a leader, it's when, not if. Why? The possible reason, and here I paraphrase Rabbi Sachs, is that the high priests and the Sanhedrin were in constant contact with the holy. They lived in a world of the ideals. The king or the political, those who are out in the world bringing Torah to the world, they're out in the world. And so, on the one hand, they can't avoid making mistakes sometimes, because when you're out in the world making decisions, there is no textbook that infallibly teaches you how to lead. And there are no set rules all the time for how you apply the principles of the Torah. Because, as Ted noted, different people's situations are different, and different times call for different responses. Priests and judges follow laws. For leadership, they are guided by laws, but every situation is unique. As Isaiah Berlin put it in his essay on political judgment with which I began, political judgment in the realm of political action, he says, there are few laws, and what is needed is skill in reading a situation. Successful statesmen, he writes, grasp the unique combination of characteristics that constitute this particular situation, this and no other. Or as Rabbi Sachs puts it, applying inflexible rules to a constant shifting landscape can at times destroy societies. And the point then is that there is a need for Kohanim, for a Sanhedrin, who dwell in the Mikdash, divining the Torah and its laws, and there is a need for Jewish leaders out in the world, who bring the Torah to the world and apply its concepts to people's lives. Regarding the leaders that are out in the world, The Torah has a combination of realism and idealism. As Rabbi Sachs puts it, what matters is not that the leaders never get it wrong. That's inevitable, given the nature of leadership. But that like the king himself, they bear the Torah with them wherever they go. They constantly study the Torah to remind themselves of the transcendent standards and ultimate aims of Judaism, even as they dwell not in the Mikdash, but amidst their brethren. We're now able, I think, to understand the separation of Kuna and Malchut. The Kohanim are linked to a specific location, the Mikdash, whereas the Malchut is meant to expand and embrace all elements of Klal Yisrael. And that is why, by the way, the Malchut must come from Yehuda. Many of you may recall reading about the sociologist Robert Bella's essay on radical individualism in America. Many Americans, Bella argued, live solely for themselves, for their own personal needs and desires, what Bella called the imperial republic of self. As an example of this individualism, Robert Bella cited the case of Sheila Larson, who was once asked to describe her faith, and Sheila responded that her faith was called Sheilaism, which was just her own little voice telling her to live for herself and to do what was meaningful to her. And I believe it was Rabbi J.J. Schachter who cleverly remarked that the story of Sheilaism and Sheila would have been a lot more confusing had her name been Judy. And jokes aside, Judaism is the opposite of Sheilaism. Our nation, our faith, Jews, Judaism is named through history, through happenstance, but ultimately providentially. We are named for Yehuda. Our faith is Yahadut. We practice Judaism, named for the star of this coming Parsha, Yehuda who is imperfect, Yehuda who fails and who repents spectacularly. And that, my grandfather of Aaron Soloveichik Zatzal once said, is precisely the point. If Yehuda becomes the Melech, if his tribe ultimately embodies the nation, it is because of the proud proclamation that he makes regarding his half-brother Binyamin. Anochi eravti et hanar. He says, I am the guarantor, I am responsible for this other young man. He is my brother. I am responsible for him. His life is in my hands. I am Yehuda, and I say this. The kingship is not given to Levi, nor is it granted to Yosef. Yosef, who is so politically gifted. There's a surprise ending at the end of Sefer Breshit. If we expected the kingship to go to anybody, we would expect it to go to Yosef. Yosef, who seems to be the best leader. He has the best resume. He has private sector experience. He worked for Potiphar. He has civic experience. He ran a superpower, saved civilization from starvation. And then, all of a sudden, at the end of Parshat Vayechi, my apologies, a spoiler alert, at the end of the book, we are told all of a sudden, Yaakov says, Lo yasur shevet mi Yehuda u'mechokek mi bein raglav. The scepter shall not depart from Judah. Kingship is not given to Levi nor to Yosef, who is so politically gifted and yet tragically cannot fully connect with his brothers. It is given to Yehuda, who bonds with Binyamin despite their differences. Kohanim and Malchut relate to different spheres. And they demand different spheres. And they demand different people with different gifts and different vocations. And that is why it was wrong for the Chashmonaim to claim the Malchut. That is why the fulfillment of their destiny was cleansing the Beit HaMikdash. And that is why we celebrate on Hanukkah the Kohanim in 165 BCE being mitaher the temple. But we do not celebrate what followed, the Kohanic monarchy. The two are not supposed to be combined. Rather, Kohuna and Malchut complement one another. There is a role for high priest and a role for a king. And if we pay close attention to the Jewish calendar, we find that even the rhythms of the calendar make this distinction. The Jewish calendar is not coincidental, and the rhythm of its liturgy in our lives dramatically determines every little aspect of the way Jews see things. I'll give you one famous example that I cite all the time, and that is the origin of a Yiddish word, shlemiel, right? Scholars spend a lot of time, Yiddish scholars, trying to find the origin of the word shlemiel. This is true, I'm not making this up. This is what people do in the academy, Ted. They work on the origins of the word shlemiel. Most Yiddish words have some sort of Jewish derivation, and we know there is only one name in all of Tanakh that sounds like this, and what is that? one of the Nisi'im, one of the leaders of the Shevet, Shlumiel ben Suri Shaddai. Shlumiel ben Suri Shaddai is read on which day of Hanukkah? Today, right? The 5th day of Hanukkah. Okay, it's okay. I'll just assume you all knew, and you were just too embarrassed to say. Right? We read the Nisi'im on different days of Hanukkah. Today is Shlumiel ben Suri Shaddai's day. Now, what did he ever do to, given the pattern of liturgical cadence and its impact on Yiddish, it seems logical to assume that there's some source here. But what did Shlumiel ben Suri Shaddai ever do to deserve eternal affiliation with Shlumielhood? The answer lies in the fact that on Shabbat Chanukah, we read as maftir, whatever Nasi is that day. And my friends, there is only one day of Chanukah that can never come out on Shabbat, and that is the 5th day. And thus, Shlumiel ben Suri Shaddai is, as it were, the meandering maftir that can never find his way to Shabbat. Now, and this scholars actually say, with actual honesty and I think validity, is the origin through the cadence of the Jewish calendar of the term Shlumiel. But that's interesting. But what people focus is on things like that. And what they don't focus on is on what parsha, not what maftir can never fall on Shabbat Chanukah, but what parsha never falls out on Chanukah, but always comes out immediately after Chanukah. What must always follow Chanukah. And that is Parshat Vayechi, the parsha in which Yaakov names Yehuda as the father of the monarchy. Parshat Miketz is almost always on Chanukah. Parshat Vayigash can be on Chanukah. People always ask, why is the Yosef story always taking place on Chanukah? I think that's to ask the wrong question. The point is not what Kriya happens during Chanukah. The point is what Kriya follows Chanukah. And now the calendar comes in perfect cadence. We celebrate the Kohanim cleansing the temple, but not the Kohanic monarchy that followed. And as if to exhibit this, we celebrate during this time period the Kohanim, we celebrate the Kohanim, and then immediately after that, we celebrate Lo Yasur Shevet Mihuda Mechokek Mi Bein Raglav, stating that we celebrate B'yimei Mattityahu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol Chashmonai Uvanav V'achar Kein Bo Vanech L'dvir Beitecha V'tiaru Et Mikdashecha. But what followed, we reiterate the importance of the two spheres, Lo Yasur Shevet Mihuda. And so the observance of Chanukah and the Shabbat that follows, the Shabbat of Lo Yasur, allows us, I think, to better appreciate these two distinct spiritual roles and to apply them both to the rabbinate and to Jewish leadership today. First, we have the Kohanim, led by the Kohen Gadol. And I think that we are right to say that the modern version of this is truly the Yeshiva, led by the Rosh Yeshiva, who are its Kohanim Gedolim, and who expose us to the Torah. Moreover, the king who has to come to, interestingly actually, if you study the biography of Bernard Revel, you'll see that when in 1928 they built the building with the dome, the beautiful building with the dome, everybody celebrated, and my great-grandfather of Moshe Soloveichik both celebrated but also mournfully noted all that he had left behind in Europe. He quoted the pasuk in Sefer Ezra that when they built the second Beit HaMikdash, so everybody celebrated, but the Zikanim who had experienced the first Beit HaMikdash also mourned what had been missed. And this is an important point. There are every generation has its own Beit HaMikdash, and that Beit HaMikdash of that generation is the Yeshiva. And it is our, as it were, our modern Mikdash. And it is where rabbis, all future rabbis, those studying to be rabbis and those who are already rabbis, come to check their own Sifrei Torah. It is where they're, just like the Melech, who brings his Torah to the Beit HaMikdash. It is where their principles are formed, where their Torah is imbibed, and where the most complex of questions are answered, like with the Sanhedrin, by those uniquely qualified to do so. And yet, to only focus on this is to miss half the story. Even as the immersion in the modern Mikdash is admirable, even as it's essential for Torah growth, inherent in the immersion only in the mikdash also lies a danger of, if you will, of students who dwell only here developing a spiritual Sheilaism of their own that we must caution against, lest we lose Yehuda's ability to connect with our brethren that are so different than ourselves. We are not all meant to be Kohanim Gedolim. There is an equally important vocation in Jewish leadership. Kohanim Gedolim have their own apartment here in the Beit HaMikdash, just like Rav Soloveichik had his own apartment here in Morgue Lounge. I'm not sure if I'm comparing Morgue Lounge to the Beit HaMikdash, but the Yeshiva surely. And quite famously, actually, that reminds me of when once he was in his apartment and a student on the second floor was playing loud rock music at 3 a.m. So Rav Soloveichik put on his robe and went up to the second floor and knocks on the student's door. The student, wearing God knows what, opens the door and sees Rav Soloveichik standing right in front of him. And Rav Soloveichik looked at him and said, "It's 3 a.m. People are trying to learn." So Rav Soloveichik was like that Kohen Gadol. Rav Soloveichik who dwelled here in an apartment and making the yeshiva, as it were, when he was here, his place of residence. But we are not all meant to be Kohanim Gedolim. And the lesson of what Jewish royalty means is that in choosing our vocations, we can become royal because royalty lies not in power, but in how we live our lives and how we dedicate ourselves to others. And it was my own teacher, Rabbi Norman Lamb, who noted this in an address here at Yeshiva at the 1983 Chag HaSmicha. He noted that about some Yeshiva students, he noted, and I'm going to quote Rabbi Lamb, as I tell Rabbi Lamb, whenever I quote criticism, I just quote him. So this way people could just blame him instead of me. If that's okay with you, Ted. So Rabbi Lamb said, the problem with too many of us in the Yeshiva is that we've somehow managed to assimilate excessively the spirit of the times. He says, society today is highly narcissistic. Everywhere it seems we are admonished to undertake the quest for self-fulfillment, for self-expression, for self-realization. He says, unfortunately, he says, the danger is that if all of us see our vocation as being here, he says in his words, we have too often adopted that self-centeredness in its spiritual form. We are too concerned sometimes with our own Torah growth, and the result of this spiritual introversion is an indifference, at times even an antipathy to Jews who are unlike us, who are, by our standards, deficient in learning or in commitment or in observance. As a consequence, Rabbi Lamb said, even those who admirably devote their lives to the teaching of Torah all too often confine themselves to preaching to the converted and come to see themselves only as halachic technicians. Their sense of responsibility for others' lives, physical as well as intellectual, worldly as well as spiritual, psychologically as well as scholarly, is inadequate, end quote. There is a role for both, Rabbi Lamb is saying. Rabbi Lamb is saying there is a role for the Kohanim Gedolim who lead here at Yeshiva. But there is a role also for those who have to see their role as milachim in miniature, who actually go out, as the Melech was called to do, to embrace Jews who are so different than themselves, and carrying the Torah from the Beit HaMikdash, and using their skill at leadership to apply the principles of the Torah and sharing the light of the Torah to the unique situations of their own community. What Rabbi Lamb is saying is that we are in danger of losing, to use what Ted said, the development of the skills, the gifts, and the drive to be like the shul rabbi in Hampton, Virginia, or the shul rabbi somewhere else, who is so often the congregant's one and only connection to Judaism, to their faith, to their history. A rabbi who could connect with Jews so different from himself, who brought the Torah from the Mikdash to the real world, exhibiting Malchut at its highest, opening one's heart to embrace others, and thereby changing their lives forever. Our obligation is to cultivate both forms of leadership. Hanukkah is about celebrating the kahuna, celebrating its centrality to Jewish life, and to keeping pure the Mikdash, both the original Mikdash and its modern instantiations today. But immediately after Hanukkah, we celebrate the Malchut of Yehudah and what it means to be a leader in Judaism. And we commit ourselves to also celebrating those forms of leadership who take the Torah from the yeshiva and bring it to communities and apply its principles to the unique situations in which they find themselves. In 1966, Shai Agnon, Shmuel Yosef Agnon, became the first Israeli to be awarded the Nobel Prize. He was informed that on December 10th in the Royal Palace of Stockholm, he would receive the prize from the hands of His Royal Majesty, King Gustav of Sweden himself. Agnon, in turn, informed His Majesty that he would have to be late, as December 10th fell out on Shabbat. So the king sent a stretch limo on Shabbat afternoon, idling impatiently outside, waiting to take Agnon to the Nobel Prize ceremony. Although the ceremony had already started, Agnon took his time. He waited till Shabbat was over. He davened Meir. He made Havdalah marking the Sabbath's end. Only then did he get dressed for the ceremony. The chauffeur was champing at the bit, desperate to go. He had been ordered by a king to get to the palace as soon as possible. But Agnon could not leave yet. You see, it was also Hanukkah, and so he had to light 4 candles, pausing to ponder the miraculous existence throughout the ages of the people that he would be representing that evening, and the divine source of that endurance. Finally, he got into the limousine, and the limousine rushed him across Stockholm with a siren-wailing motorcycle escort. The stretch limo, the regal car of the king, proved useless because Agnon had to sit in the front seat with the driver so he could plug in his shaver and the cigarette lighter to eliminate the Shabbos beard that he had grown. Finally, he arrived just in time to receive the Nobel Prize for Literature from the king. One was supposed to accept the prize silently and then back away from the royal presence because you're a commoner, you don't talk to the king. And so reporters were shocked to see his lips moving as he stood before the king. This is based on a version that I've read. And they asked him afterwards, Mr. Agnon, what did you say to the king? You're not supposed to talk to the king. What did you say to the king? And Agnon said, I wasn't speaking to the king. I was addressing the King of Kings, saying the bracha that you're supposed to say when you see a human monarch. A blessing, said Agnon, that I had never said before, but had been eager to say. Baruch atah Hashem, asher natan mikvodo lebasar vadam. Blessed are you, the true King, who shares of his majesty with flesh and blood. Malchut in Judaism is not the limo or the palace or the prize. It lies in imitating the King of Kings, whose malchut, according to Jewish thought, is manifest in the Shekhinah that dwells amongst the people. And the challenge facing those of us who work at the cultivation of Jewish leaders today is to make a place for 2 models of leadership. Yes, the Kohen Gadol, but also the Melech who in his life embodies the Melech Malchei HaMelachim, not with his physical regal splendor, because Ha'adam Yireh La'einayim v'Hashem Yireh La'levav. Rather, Jewish leaders who expand their hearts to include so many and show the gift that the king is supposed to have in taking the Torah from the Beit HaMikdash and in connecting it to people who are so very different than him, in making their existential needs his needs, their spiritual lives his spiritual life. Rabbi Allan Mervis was such a man, and that is why it is such a privilege to honor his legacy and to honor the rabbinate that he embodied here on Hanukkah with you today. Hanukkah Sameach, and thank you so much.